Make the little things feel like luxury again. Deep appreciation for things that you didn't really think about before. Pay off your debt. Freedom. Live like a hermit in the woods. These are some of the ideas and thought bubbles around van life, and I want to tell you from my personal experience, the good and the bad. Hey everyone, this is Ray's Radio, and today I want to talk to you about my experience in van life. Now, when I was doing van life, I would have people message me on Instagram and say, "You saw your van, but you're not really talking about it very much. How come you don't tell your stories about van life on Instagram?" And that's because at that time it was a little bit more private for me. I didn't necessarily want everyone to know that I was in my van. It wasn't part of what I wanted to share on Instagram. It wasn't my business. Like, being in a van, being a content creator wasn't what I was doing with my life. It just became a part of my life, and it was an episode of my life, a phase that is now complete. And so that's why I want to share what I learned during that time. I'm also now living a debt-free life, which a lot of people can't say. So I am very, very proud of the time that I spent there, all that I learned, and all of the medicine that I experienced. I want to share with you the good and the bad of van life. So one of the first things I want to say is that I got by with a little help from my friends. There is no way that I would have been able to learn all the electrician skills and mechanical skills to be able to actually build out a van. I had help. And I had really smart friends help me with these parts of building out a van that I do not have the skills, the knowledge to do safely. So I'm very grateful to all of the friends along the way who helped me build, and then I flipped. I've had 3 vans. I've had a blue 1998 Chevy, had a black 99 Chevy. So my first Chevy, my blue one, I called Freddie, and the black one I called Jimmy. And I flipped that black van to a metal rock band from Montreal. They drove all the way. And then when I flipped that, I bought a white 2005 Ford E350, which I have just sold. So as I'm leaving this phase of my life, that's why I feel like it's the perfect time to share what I learned. And I want to give people a really good perspective of the good and bad, so that if people are considering it, they understand the depths of what they're getting into. Now, this is just my opinion. There are tons of people's stories online. If you just even go into if you go on YouTube or Instagram, a lot of it is really glorified. So you want to make sure that you're looking at stories of people who are going to share with you the realities of this life. Because when I started building out my first blue 98 Chevy, I never thought that I was going to find mouse poop in the roof, right? Like that, I was not expecting that to be part of my journey, but it was. And so sometimes when we start pulling things apart, we find things we don't want to find. And there's a lot of pieces along the journey where I could have said, you know what, this is too much for me, I'm done. But I kept going with it. And so that's how I have so much to share. I did see a little bit of the glorification of it on Instagram. I didn't fall for it that way. Like, I knew that it wasn't going to be always great, and it definitely wasn't. It's nice when people, post their beautiful experiences and their shots of these beautiful views that they get, and all of that is accessible. But it's only showing one side of the story. It's not showing the breakdowns mechanically. It's not showing the emotional breakdowns. It's not showing not being able to cook food properly, or having things go wrong in the build so that you can't use electricity that night. It's not showing being stranded somewhere and needing help, needing a repair. And it's not showing strangers making you really uncomfortable. So these are some of the warnings that I want to share today. And I have quite a few different limbs with which to share. So the first one I want to talk about is health. I want to talk about cultural. I want to talk about emotional and practical. Now, again, these are all from my experience. The main things I want to share in health are cleanliness is something to consider. Cleanliness is a really interesting problem. It's not something that you have to consider when you're living in a place with running water, because unless you're struggling with mental health, it's pretty easy to just hop in the shower and deal with your own cleanliness. You don't have that in a van necessarily. So you either have to find other ways to keep yourself clean, like gyms. You have to go and use public bodies of water to clean yourself. And this is a really different way to live. And some people, just for that, that's too much for them already. It's like, no thanks. I don't want to deal with that. So yes, that is a reality, is that unless you build a shower into your van, you're going to have to figure out alternative ways of cleaning yourself. The other interesting thing about cleanliness and health that people do not think about in van life is it really transforms your experience of having to deal with your own waste. This is something that people don't think about, right? We just get to flush it away and it's gone. Or when we're throwing things in the garbage, just the garbage man takes it away. When you're living in van life, you have the deep responsibility to care for your own waste. Where do I put it? Where is this going? How is this affecting things around me? You have to work your life differently around these things, right? Like I would make extra stops at certain places so that I could use their garbage can. When you have a apartment or a home, you just throw it in the garbage and you know that the garbage man will take it away on Tuesday morning. But when you don't have that, you have to think about it yourself. And you have to. It is your responsibility to think about that. Dealing with your own waste and your own garbage is one of the interesting downsides to living this way. I have such a deep appreciation for water now that I didn't have before I was in my van. Every single day now, when I'm in the shower, I am so grateful for running water. And I say it out loud. I'm like, oh gosh, running water, this is so lovely. So it has deepened my experience of appreciation for the really basic things. Now, water is a sacred medicine. It's very, very special. And so I was able to deepen my relationship with water when it was less accessible to me. When I didn't have running water, I appreciated water so much more. I had to go and find my own water. I had to filter my own water if I couldn't find a water filtration center. So I had to deal with it differently. And I had to be smart with it. I had to gauge how much water I needed for drinking versus cleaning versus doing the dishes. So I had to think about water really differently. So now I get to have that deep appreciation and carry it in a different way. I get to hold my appreciation for water in a different way. Culturally, what I wanted to talk about is safety and fear. In this lifestyle, there's two different types of people that are going to be looking at you. There's a lot of people that won't look at you, and that's great. There's people that are going to be watching out for you, and there's going to be people that are watching you. And the last one is the one that you want to be really careful of. So it's really important that you go with your gut. It's really important that you follow your intuition. And I can't stress that enough. I only had one really bad experience where someone actually knocked on my window and was laughing and saying mean things and trying to get me to come out. And I actually fumbled around and grabbed my bear mace, which I hadn't done before. And I had been in there for a long time before something like that happened. But that was a moment where, 4 a.m. and you wake up with your heart pounding and there's a man on a bicycle outside sneering at you. Those are moments that are life-altering. And so we have to be really careful. After that, I got very, very aware of telling someone where I was, how long I was going to be there, and making sure that at least one person knew where I was at all times. One of the most beautiful shares around culture that I can tell you about is my connection to the land deepened so much more. And it really helped me in my medicine journey, my shamanic medicine journey, to really deepen my relationship with the land around me and the plants around me. Waking up and looking at sage or stepping out onto the dirt at 6 a.m. Like, those are moments that are just burned into my brain as some of the most beautiful memories. And most people only get to capture those once in a while if they decide to go camping or hiking. But when you wake up to that every day, you really get to know the landscape. You really get to see the changes. You get to communicate with it in a different way, and you get to understand it better and actually learn to work with these medicines and these plants. Thinking about food in a different way, you have to really plan things, and if you don't plan, you're going to end up feeling tempted by fast food. Now, I don't eat fast food, so there was times where I wasn't eating, even though I wanted to eat, but I hadn't planned properly. So it was a really interesting lesson in how to think about food differently. I also wanted to support underground food and farmers as much as possible. So I would shop at fruit stands more. I would shop at farm stands more. It was an interesting challenge though, because I did not have a kitchen in my van. So I had to eat in a really different way. Embraced mono meals. And mono meals is where you're just eating one thing. And I didn't mean to embrace mono meals. I didn't mean to, start this new diet. Like it wasn't a diet. It's just how my style of eating evolved when I was there. It just kind of evolved that way because that was the simplest way to eat. Because I only had such a small cooler, I had to be really smart with what I was buying because I only had so much space. So I did have to buy food more often, but I also couldn't have big complex meals. Even a stir fry was too much unless I wanted to have a bunch of equipment and be constantly making a fire to make food, which I definitely didn't want to do. Because especially in the summer, I just wanted to eat a lot of raw food. So I'd end up eating a lot of the same foods, and that's what mono meals is. So I would have for my lunch, I would just eat a whole container of peaches or a whole thing of cherries. That was fun. So it happened that way that I would have, really simple meals, like really basic things like, avocado squished on bread or bananas with peanut butter. And that would be my whole meal. And so it did change my view of eating simple and even simpler than I had already been teaching. And that sort of deepened my relationship with minimalism because I started understanding that minimalism has, layers and nuances. And so for the emotional side, I wanted to talk about extreme isolation. So there was periods for me where I would go off grid and friends would be a little bit concerned. Now I was just living my life and I was fine and everything was good. But the downside of extreme isolation is that if you're not very careful, it can throw you into a mental health concern or throw you into other places that are dark because humans need other humans. And as much as I have really deeply embraced my introvert side, and I can thank VanLife for that, I forced myself into these uncomfortable situations of being alone for a long time, for long periods at a time, and I'm very deeply grateful that I was able to embrace my inner introvert that I never had before. I'm very grateful for that. However, it was dangerous. Socially, it's a bit dangerous to be that extremely isolated up in the middle of nowhere, sometimes even out of service. I understand the danger of that, potential danger of that. And emotionally and mentally, there is a danger there. So that is something that I wanted to speak to as a warning or a cautionary tale that isolation is good, but make sure people know where you are and make sure that you come back to society, every once in a while. And we need to have people around us. The second part of emotional that I wanted to share was about the stress of constant repairs. This became a very challenging and an emotional part of van life for me because I'm not Mrs. Fix-It. I'm really, really not. I don't have mechanical DIY repair skills. I'm just not good at stuff like that. My brain doesn't work that way. I really encourage, people to be really practical about this and make sure that you have some really basic safety things in the van. So I always had coolant, oil, spare parts to help me repair things that needed if things were breaking down. WD-40, duct tape, things like that. And then just for safety, of course, I always did have my bear mace, which luckily I did not have to use, but having it makes you feel a little bit more protected that you're okay in there. So the stress of the constant repairs, that is a really challenging part. And if you go look into forums or read about other people's experience of van life, they're all going to say that as well. Be prepared for things to break down. And the hardest part about that is that when your van breaks down in van life, you are now stranded. So you have to have a backup plan. You have to have either money for hotels and money for the repairs, or you have to have friends around. This is why I didn't go too far away from areas where I had friends nearby, because I needed that safety backup plan that if anything went wrong, I could just go stay at this person's house. So I've kind of combined the emotional and the practical limbs that I wanted to share about. So my last 2 points in the emotional category are minimalism and psychology. So in minimalism for emotional, the piece about that I wanted to share was of course, when you're doing this, you have to really downgrade your life. Now, I had already been on a minimalist journey, and I started it in, I think, maybe 2016, and I had already gotten rid of so many of my personal items, enough that I could fit my whole life into a car. So I was already primed for being in a van years before I was actually in the van, and I was ready to have that minimalist life where I had very few things. And the interesting thing about being super minimalist in the van is that even though you have very few things, it feels like you have so much because it's in such a crammed space. So you're constantly moving things around, and the emotional toll of that can be a lot. The psychology under my emotional category, I put the psychology of nowhere to go can be stressful. If you're not someone who's like, go with the flow, I'm cool to just go sit at the beach or go for a hike, go for coffee or meet people on a spontaneous meeting, like if you're not like that, you're going to be very uncomfortable because there are times where either your van is broken down or maybe it's too hot to be in at these certain hours and you can't be in there. And so you're going to have to find other ways to bide your time. And that can be very uncomfortable for people because we're not in our safety spot anymore. So when we have to let go of that and then we're just on our own, that's very uncomfortable. So psychologically, that can be a huge challenge. My last two pieces in the practical category, I put intuition and bear spray. And again, that's just about safety. You have to be really intuitive about where you're staying. You want to make sure that you have things in the van that make you feel safe. And I think it's really important to remember that there's going to be many times where you don't feel safe. And so you have to decide, is this a real fear or is this my intuition saying leave? Because the nice thing about not feeling safe is that you can just get up, turn on the van and drive away. So you have the choice to keep yourself safer by having your, spidey senses awake and aware. I remember I have a memory of writing to my pen pal and saying these red clay streaks on my thigh. And that was one of my sort of writer's way of describing the sand in the area that I was staying at that time. It became this term to represent the freedom of being in the van. And so then it would come up later in other writings like, oh, are you craving that red streak again? It had sort of become this aesthetic about this running and this freedom. I think of that quote by Jimi Hendrix, if I'm free, it's because I'm always running. And when nobody wakes you up in the morning and nobody waits for you at night, when you can do whatever you want, is it freedom or loneliness? So I had two experiences of feeling really good and really bad in the van, that as I was writing out some of the things I wanted to talk about today, these are the memories came up of good and bad. So I have a memory of, and this is of course not just one night, but of feeling like, okay, I have solar power, I have battery, I have water, I have food in the cooler, and I have a fire. Life is good. This is good. This feels good. And then there was another time where I was like, there's rain, there's lightning, my roof is leaking, my heater just broke, I'm almost out of gas, and I'm way out of town. I'm waiting for this hawk to come tell me if I'm allowed to stay here or not. Like, what the fuck am I doing? And I had there was one spot that I would go to, and the first time I was there, I saw this hawk circling right where I wanted to park, and I felt like it was his way of saying, like, welcome, you can be here. So then when I would return to that spot every time, I felt that I had to wait for this hawk to come and give me permission again, which he did the second time. But the third time, I was waiting and waiting and waiting, and as I was waiting, this storm moved in. And then I hopped in the van to just turn on my heater and be cozy in the van, and the heater was broken. And that's a moment where I just thought, oh, this is madness. What am I doing? This is madness. Having experienced van life really changed my worldview. There is a good and bad in everything. At times, things felt tight, small, squeezed, lacking, and uncomfortable. And at other times, things felt open, free, independent, and peaceful. I've seen the clouds from both sides now.